A homeless girl slept on a park bench every night until a police officer found her. What this cop does next is unbelievable. Who was this homeless girl? And how did the cop change her life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Daniel Brooks eased his patrol car through the winding roads of Oakwood Park, his eyes scanning the shadowy landscape. The familiar sights did little to lift his weary spirit. Streetlights cast a pale glow on empty benches and silent playground equipment, creating a scene he'd witnessed countless times before. Daniel sighed, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. At 55, he was counting down the days until retirement, but the thought brought him no joy. Years of service had left him feeling hollow, like he was just going through the motions. He pulled over to the curb, killing the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by the soft chirping of crickets. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. Another night, another patrol, he muttered to himself, his voice rough with fatigue. Opening his eyes, Daniel gazed out at the park. He remembered a time when he'd been full of hope, eager to make a difference in his community. Now, after decades on the force, that optimism had faded. He'd seen too many repeat offenders, too many broken families, too many problems that seemed to have no real solution. He reached for his thermos of coffee, taking a long sip of the lukewarm liquid. The bitter taste matched his mood. Driving through the night, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was just going through the motions. Each turn, each street, blended into a monotonous routine he knew by heart. Then he noticed something odd and stepped out of his cruiser. His vehicle's light caught something unusual, a small figure huddled on a park bench. He slowed the car, peering through the windshield. There, curled up under a thin, tattered blanket, was a little girl. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, her face peaceful in sleep despite the chill night air. Daniel's hand hovered over the radio. Protocol dictated he should call this in, get social services involved. It was the proper procedure, the safe option. But something made him hesitate. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Her clothes were dirty and worn, her shoes scuffed and too small for her feet. Daniel's heart clenched. He'd seen plenty of hard cases in his career, but the sight of this vulnerable child struck him differently. It stirred something deep within him, a protective instinct he thought had long since faded. As he stood there, torn between duty and compassion, the girl's eyes fluttered open. She sat up quickly, clutching her rabbit tighter and regarding Daniel with a mix of fear and wariness. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, crouching down to her level. "I'm a police officer. My name's Daniel. What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Maya." "Maya," Daniel repeated gently. "That's a pretty name. Are you out here all alone?" Maya nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said, her voice quivering. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "What about your parents, Maya?" At this, the dam broke. Tears spilled down Maya's cheeks as she spoke. "They're gone. There was a car crash." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd dealt with tragedy before, but hearing it from this small, brave girl was different. It pierced through the layers of cynicism he'd built up over the years. "I'm so sorry, Maya," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "How long have you been out here?" Maya shrugged, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I don't know. I stay hidden so they don't take me back to the shelter. It was scary there." Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness. At that moment, Daniel knew he couldn't simply radio this in and walk away. The realization both terrified and invigorated him. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of true purpose. He realized that this little child ran away from her orphanage, wanting to live a better life. "Come on, Maya," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm for the night." Maya's eyes widened with fear. "You're not taking me back to the shelter, are you?" Daniel shook his head. "No, not tonight. We're going to the police station. It's safe there, and you can get some rest." Relief washed over Maya's face. She gathered her stuffed rabbit and the thin blanket, following Daniel to his patrol car. As they drove, Daniel glanced at Maya in the rearview mirror. She sat quietly, her eyes darting around nervously. "You okay back there?" he asked. Maya nodded. "I'm just scared they'll find me," she whispered. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Who, Maya?" "The social services people," she replied, her voice barely audible. They weren't nice at the shelter. I don't want to go back." Daniel felt a pang in his chest. He knew he should report this, should follow protocol, but the fear in Maya's eyes made him hesitate. "Can you tell me what happened at the shelter?" he asked gently. Maya hugged her rabbit tighter. It was crowded. The big kids were mean, and the adults, they didn't care. They yelled a lot. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes pleading. "Please don't make me go back." Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing. He was breaking every rule in the book by not reporting this immediately, but the thought of sending Maya back into a system that had already failed her made his stomach churn. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Daniel made a decision. He'd keep Maya here tonight, give her a safe place to sleep. Tomorrow, he'd figure out what to do next. "Listen, Maya," he said, turning to face her. "You're safe here tonight, I promise. We'll sort everything out in the morning, okay?" Maya nodded, a small smile of gratitude on her face. "Thank you, Officer Daniel." Daniel led Maya into the station, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. The night shift was quiet, with only a few officers milling about. He guided Maya to his desk, pulling up a chair for her. "Here, sit down," he said softly. "Are you hungry? I think we have some snacks in the break room." Maya nodded, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. Daniel quickly fetched a granola bar and a juice box, placing them in front of her. As Maya ate, Daniel picked up the phone. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed the number for Child Protective Services. He knew it was protocol, but something in his gut told him it wasn't the right thing to do. A tired voice answered on the third ring. "Child Protective Services, how can I help you?" Daniel cleared his throat. "This is Officer Daniel Brooks. I've got a minor here at the station. She's been living on the streets." The woman on the other end sighed. "Okay, we'll send someone to pick her up. We'll place her in emergency foster care or a shelter for now." Daniel glanced at Maya, who was watching him with fear in her eyes. "Wait," he said into the phone. "What exactly happens when you take her?" "Well, she'll be placed in a shelter until we can find a foster home. It might take a few months, maybe longer. The shelters are pretty full right now." Daniel's stomach churned. He thought of Maya's words about the shelter, the fear in her voice. And what about her safety, her well-being? The woman's voice turned defensive. "We do our best, officer, but resources are limited. We can't guarantee individual attention for every child." As Daniel listened to the cold, bureaucratic response, he looked at Maya again. She was hugging her stuffed rabbit tightly, her small frame tense with worry. In that moment, he made his decision. "I see," he said into the phone. "Thank you for the information. I'll call back if we need further assistance." He hung up, his heart racing. What he was about to do went against everything he'd been taught as an officer, but looking at Maya, he knew he couldn't send her back into a system that had already failed her. "Maya," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair, "how would you like to come stay at my place tonight? It's warm, and you'll have a real bed to sleep in." Maya's eyes lit up, a mix of hope and disbelief. "Really? You mean it?" Daniel nodded, forcing a smile despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. "I do. Come on, let's get out of here." As they walked out of the station, Daniel felt the weight of his decision. He was breaking rules, risking his career, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. He just hoped he could figure out what to do next. Daniel unlocked the door to his modest apartment, ushering Maya inside. The place suddenly felt different with her presence, less empty somehow. "It's not much, but it's home," he said, flicking on the lights. "Make yourself comfortable." Maya stood in the middle of the living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes darted around, taking in every detail. "Are you hungry?" Daniel asked, realizing he hadn't thought about food. "I could make some soup." Maya nodded shyly. "Yes, please." As Daniel heated up the soup, he watched Maya from the kitchen. She moved cautiously, touching things gently, as if afraid they might disappear. It struck him how little she had, how uncertain her world must be. They ate at the small kitchen table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Daniel found himself studying Maya's face, noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders relaxed a little with each spoonful. "Thank you," Maya said softly when she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "You're welcome, kiddo." After dinner, Daniel showed Maya to the spare room. It was mostly empty, save for a bed and a small dresser. "You can sleep here," he said. "I'll be just down the hall if you need anything." Maya nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the room. "It's so big," she murmured. Daniel's heart clenched. He wondered how long it had been since she'd slept in a real bed. "Well, it's all yours for now. Get some rest, okay?" As he turned to leave, Maya's small voice stopped him. "Officer Brooks?" He looked back. "You can call me Daniel if you want." Maya nodded, a tiny smile playing at her lips. "Daniel, thank you for not sending me back." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "You're safe here, Maya. I promise." Later, as Daniel lay in his own bed, he found himself listening for any sound from Maya's room. He realized with a start that he'd grown used to coming home to an empty apartment, to the silence that greeted him every night. Now, knowing Maya was just down the hall, he felt an odd sense of comfort. But with that comfort came a gnawing worry. What he was doing was illegal. He could lose his job, face criminal charges. Yet every time he thought about calling Child Protective Services, he remembered the fear in Maya's eyes, the way she'd clung to her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. The next morning, Daniel woke early, his mind already racing with the challenges ahead. He glanced at the closed door of Maya's room, a mix of worry and determination settling in his chest. He made his way to the kitchen, starting a pot of coffee. As it brewed, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. Years on the force had given him connections, but he'd never needed them quite like this before. His first call was to Sarah, a social worker he'd worked with on several cases. "Hey Sarah, it's Daniel Brooks. I've got a situation." As he explained Maya's case, careful to keep details vague, he could hear the hesitation in Sarah's voice. "Daniel, you know I want to help, but there are protocols. We can't just—" I know," Daniel sighed, rubbing his forehead. "But this kid, she's different. She needs more than just a bed in a shelter." Sarah's tone softened. "I understand, but my hands are tied. The best I can do is put her case on priority, but even then, it could take weeks." After hanging up, Daniel felt a knot forming in his stomach. Weeks. Maya didn't have weeks. His next call was to Tom at the local shelter. "Tom, it's Daniel. I've got a young girl who needs placement. Anything available?" Tom's response was quick and apologetic. "Sorry, Daniel, we're packed to the rafters. I've got a waiting list a mile long." Call after call, Daniel hit the same wall of bureaucracy and overcrowded systems. Each conversation left him feeling more frustrated and helpless. As he hung up from his latest attempt, he heard a small voice behind him. "Daniel?" He turned to see Maya standing in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The sight of her, small and vulnerable, strengthened his resolve. "Hey, kiddo," he said, forcing a smile. "How'd you sleep?" Maya shrugged, her eyes darting around the kitchen. "Okay. Are you sending me away?" Daniel's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "No, Maya. I'm trying to figure things out, but I promised you'd be safe here, remember?" She nodded, a tiny smile appearing on her face. As Daniel got up to make Maya some breakfast, he knew he was in over his head. Every legal avenue seemed blocked, yet the thought of betraying Maya's trust felt impossible. He was walking a dangerous line, and he knew it. But watching Maya eat her cereal, seeing the way she relaxed in his presence, Daniel knew he couldn't give up. Later that day, Daniel sat at his desk in the precinct, sifting through paperwork. His mind kept drifting to Maya, who was staying with his neighbor Brenda for the day. He'd told Brenda that Maya was his niece, visiting for a while. The lie sat heavy in his stomach. Officer Mike Johnson walked by, dropping a file on Daniel's desk. "Hey Brooks, you look beat. Rough night?" Daniel rubbed his eyes. "You could say that. Just a lot on my mind." Mike leaned against the desk. "Anything I can help with? You know, before you ride off into the sunset of retirement?" Daniel hesitated. He trusted Mike, but involving anyone else felt risky. Still, he needed to talk to someone. "It's about a case. A little girl, orphaned. I'm trying to find her a good home, but the system's so backed up." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, as he told Mike, "According to the paperwork, Maya's parents were killed in a car accident. That's how she ended up in the system." He paused, the words heavy in the air. "I didn't know until I looked into her file." Mike's brow furrowed and his eyes darkened with recognition. "Tom Harris. Her father was Tom Harris?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, apparently he was a cop here. It all connects now." Mike let out a long sigh, shaking his head. "Tom was one of us, a good cop, hardworking. Then, out of nowhere, he was gone. We didn't know what happened, just vanished one day. No explanation. The whole precinct was looking for him. Investigations, missing persons reports, nothing came up. And not long after that, Susan, his wife, went missing too." Daniel's heart clenched, but Mike wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "It wasn't just that, Daniel. The way they died. They were both killed in a hit-and-run accident. It was a bad crash late at night. When the officers got there, they found little Maya. She was just sitting there, on the side of the road, crying, holding onto her stuffed rabbit. Her parents were gone, but she was right there, alone in the dark." Daniel felt a wave of nausea. He could hardly picture it. Maya, so small and fragile, left crying at the scene of such a tragedy. His chest tightened with anger as the reality set in. "How could someone just drive away?" Daniel muttered, his voice full of disbelief. "How could anyone leave a little girl like that crying on the side of the road?" Mike shook his head, sharing Daniel's frustration. "We never found the driver, Daniel. Never got any leads. Whoever did it is still out there, and they left that poor girl all alone." Daniel felt a surge of hope. Maybe with the support of his fellow officers, he could find a way to keep Maya safe and give her the home she deserved. The stakes were higher now, but so was his resolve. For Maya, for Tom Harris, for the brotherhood they all shared, he would find a way. Daniel's fingers hovered over his phone. He took a deep breath and dialed Grace Taylor's number. The gentle voice of his old friend answered after 2 rings. "Daniel, it's been a while, how are you?" "Grace, I need your help," Daniel said, his voice low and urgent. "It's about a little girl. I can't go through official channels on this one." There was a pause on the other end. "Daniel, what's going on?" He explained Maya's situation, careful to leave out the part about keeping her at his house. Grace listened intently, her years of experience as a social worker evident in her thoughtful silence. "This is a delicate situation," Grace said finally, "but I'd like to meet her. Maybe we can figure something out together." Relief washed over Daniel. "Thank you, Grace. You're a lifesaver." Later that afternoon, Daniel brought Maya to Grace's cozy home. The little girl clung to his hand, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Grace greeted them at the door, her warm smile instantly putting Maya at ease. "Hello there, sweetheart. I'm Grace. Would you like some hot chocolate?" Maya nodded shyly and Grace led them into her living room. As Maya sipped her cocoa, Daniel and Grace exchanged worried glances. "Maya," Grace began gently, "Officer Daniel tells me you've been through a lot. I'd like to help if I can. Do you have any family we could contact? Maybe an aunt or uncle?" Maya shook her head, her eyes downcast. "No. It was just me and Mom and Dad." Daniel's heart sank. He'd hoped there might be a relative they could reach out to. Someone who could take Maya in legally. Grace leaned forward, her voice soft. What about friends of your parents? Anyone they were close to? Again, Maya shook her head. We moved a lot. Dad's job, I think. Daniel and Grace shared another look. The options were dwindling, but Daniel refused to give up hope. We'll figure something out, he said, as much to himself as to Maya. I promise. Grace nodded, a determined glint in her eye. Daniel's right. There's always a solution, even if we can't see it yet. As they continued to brainstorm, Daniel felt a mix of emotions. The path forward was unclear, but having Grace on their side gave him a renewed sense of hope. Together, they would find a way to give Maya the home and family she deserved. Time went back, and even though Daniel wanted to help this little girl, he only grew more and more attached to her. He knew what he was doing was not legal, but he was willing to take the risk. Maya filled a void in his life since he had no family to look after. He'd go home every night and spend time with her, decorating her room, reading stories, and even getting her into a local school nearby. Daniel was doing everything a responsible father should do. It had been a week since she started attending the local elementary school, and already he could see a change in her. The shy, scared little girl was blossoming into a cheerful, curious child. As the days passed, Daniel and Maya began to settle into a routine together. Daniel had taken her in without hesitation, and soon, his once quiet house was filled with the sounds of a child's laughter, the clinking of spoons as they ate breakfast, and the soft murmur of bedtime stories. It wasn't long before Maya felt at home, and for Daniel, the change was more welcome than he had ever expected. Every morning he would walk her to the nearby elementary school, hand in hand, while Maya told him stories about her favorite cartoons or the new games she had played with her classmates. In the evenings, they would return to the house, Maya often skipping beside him, her stuffed rabbit never far from her grasp. But there was something that began to nag at the back of Daniel's mind, something that disturbed the peace he and Maya had found in their little corner of the world. It was his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. From the moment Maya had moved in, Daniel had noticed her. She lived alone in the house across the street, an older woman who mostly kept to herself. But now, it seemed like every time Daniel looked up, there she was, peeking through her curtains or standing on her porch watching them. At first, he didn't think much of it. After all, neighbors notice new things. It was natural to be curious. But as the days turned into weeks, her behavior grew stranger, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One chilly afternoon, Daniel and Maya were playing in the front yard. Maya was chasing after a ball, her giggles echoing down the street, when Daniel noticed Mrs. Thompson standing at her window again. This time, it wasn't just a casual glance, she was staring directly at them. Her face was partially hidden by a mask, which seemed strange to Daniel, as it wasn't the middle of flu season, and no one else in the neighborhood seemed concerned about illness. She stood perfectly still, her hand gripping the curtain tightly as her eyes followed Maya's every movement. "Come on, Maya," Daniel called, trying to ignore the prickling feeling on the back of his neck. "Let's head inside. It's getting cold." As they walked toward the door, Daniel cast another glance at Mrs. Thompson's house. She was still there, her figure barely visible behind the curtain, but the moment their eyes almost met, she quickly stepped back, disappearing from view. Daniel frowned, wondering why she seemed so interested in them, but he brushed it off, telling himself he was just being paranoid. People get curious, especially when a single man suddenly starts caring for a young girl. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was just nosy, but it didn't stop there. A few days later, Daniel noticed her again. This time, he and Maya were coming home from the grocery store. They were unloading the bags from the car when he saw her standing on her porch, staring at them with that same unsettling intensity. She was wearing the mask again, despite the crisp, clean air outside. The way she watched Maya made Daniel's skin crawl. He tried not to let Maya see his discomfort, but he couldn't help but glance at Mrs. Thompson every few seconds as they carried their groceries inside. Every time he looked, she was still there, frozen in place, her eyes locked on Maya as if she was trying to figure something out. "Why does that lady always stare at us?" Maya asked innocently as they stepped into the house, her wide eyes looking up at Daniel. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. "She's probably just curious, sweetie. Maybe she's just lonely and doesn't have much to do." Maya shrugged and went back to helping him put away the groceries, but Daniel couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach. Something wasn't right about Mrs. Thompson's behavior, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The third time Daniel encountered Mrs. Thompson, it was at the grocery store, a place where he least expected anything strange to happen. It was a normal Saturday afternoon, and he and Maya had gone shopping for the week's groceries. They strolled through the aisles, Maya happily skipping ahead, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm as always. Daniel had just reached for a box of cereal when he heard a voice behind him. "Well, hello there, Officer Brooks," a familiar voice said. He turned to find Mrs. Thompson standing there, a basket in her hand and that usual polite smile on her face. But something about her seemed different this time. Her eyes darted around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," Daniel replied, keeping his tone casual. He still couldn't quite shake the odd feeling he got every time he saw her. Her masked face and her quiet demeanor always seemed a little off to him, especially considering the way she had been watching him and Maya recently. But here, in the grocery store, she appeared normal, just a neighbor out doing her errands. "You're here alone today?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice light, though Daniel noticed the way her eyes lingered on the empty space around him. "Just picking up a few things," Daniel said with a shrug, keeping the conversation short. "Maya's with me, though. She's just grabbing something in the next aisle." As soon as he mentioned Maya's name, something in Mrs. Thompson's face changed. Her smile faltered, her eyes widened slightly, and her grip on the grocery basket tightened. Daniel noticed her glance quickly toward the end of the aisle, where Maya was just beginning to come into view, clutching a bag of chips and walking back toward them. The change in Mrs. Thompson's demeanor was instant. Her entire body stiffened, and her expression became one of panic. Without another word, she turned on her heel and hurried away, moving so fast that she nearly bumped into another shopper as she fled down the next aisle. Daniel stood there, frozen in surprise for a moment. It had all happened so quickly. 1 second, she was making small talk like a normal neighbor, and the next, she was gone, fleeing the moment she saw Maya. Maya reached him then, oblivious to what had just happened. "Look what I found, Daniel," she said excitedly, holding up the bag of chips. Daniel smiled at her, trying to push aside the strange interaction he had just witnessed. "Nice choice, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. But inside, his mind was racing. Why had Mrs. Thompson reacted like that? Why did she always seem so afraid when Maya was around? It wasn't the first time he'd noticed her odd behavior. But this was something else entirely. For a brief moment, Daniel considered following Mrs. Thompson, asking her directly what her problem was, why she always seemed to be watching them. But then he stopped himself. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe she was just lonely and awkward, not used to interacting with people anymore. After all, Mrs. Thompson lived alone, and it wasn't uncommon for people to get a little strange when they spent too much time by themselves. He shook his head, brushing off the lingering suspicion that gnawed at him. There were plenty of explanations for her behavior that didn't involve anything sinister. "Come on, Maya," Daniel said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let's finish up and head home." At home, Maya settled at the kitchen table with her crayons and paper. Daniel watched as she carefully drew shapes and added splashes of color, her tongue poking out in concentration. The sight stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "What are you drawing now?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Maya held up the paper proudly. "It's us. See, that's you and that's me. We're having a picnic in the park." Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. The crude figures on the paper represented more than just a drawing. They were a family. His family. He realized with sudden clarity that Maya had brought a sense of purpose back into his life, filling a void he hadn't even known existed. Later that evening, as Daniel tucked Maya into bed, she asked him to read her favorite book, a story about a lost puppy finding its forever home. As he read, he couldn't help but draw parallels to their own situation. Maya, like the puppy in the story, had found her way into his heart and home. When he finished reading, Maya yawned and snuggled deeper into her blankets. "Good night, Officer Daniel," she mumbled sleepily. "Good night, sweetheart," Daniel replied softly, gently stroking her hair. As he turned off the light and quietly closed the door, Daniel felt a lightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the future, their future together. At work, Daniel found himself approaching his duties with renewed vigor. He patrolled the streets with a keener eye, more aware of the vulnerable people who might need help. The memory of finding Maya on that park bench stayed with him, reminding him of the real difference he could make in someone's life. "You seem different lately, Brooks," his partner, Officer Johnson, remarked one day. "Got a new lease on life or something?" Daniel smiled, thinking of Maya. "Something like that," he replied, not ready to share his secret. In the evenings, Daniel and Maya fell into a comfortable rhythm. They'd sit at the kitchen table, Maya doing her homework while Daniel prepared dinner. He found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, listening to Maya's chatter about her day and helping her with math problems. As days turned into weeks, Daniel noticed changes in himself. His colleagues commented on his softer demeanor, the way he seemed more patient with difficult cases. He realized that Maya's innocence and resilience were rubbing off on him, chipping away at the cynicism that had built up over years on the force. One night, as Daniel tucked Maya into bed, she looked up at him with her big brown eyes. "Officer Daniel," she said softly, "are you my new daddy now?" The question caught Daniel off guard. His heart swelled with love, but a flicker of fear sparked in his chest. He gently stroked Maya's hair, buying time to find the right words. "I care about you very much, Maya," he said carefully, "and I'll always be here for you. But—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain the complicated situation. Maya seemed to sense his hesitation. She nodded, her small hand reaching out to pat his arm. "It's okay. I like being here with you." As Daniel left her room, closing the door softly behind him, he leaned against the wall, his mind racing. Maya's question had brought his fears to the surface. He knew that what they had was precious, but he couldn't shake the nagging worry that it was all temporary. One evening, he watched Maya through the window as she played in the backyard, her laughter carrying on the breeze. The sight filled him with warmth, but also a deep sense of uncertainty. Grace's voice echoed in his mind from their conversation earlier that day. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she had said, her tone heavy with disappointment. "I've exhausted every lead, but there's no trace of any living relatives for Maya. Our only option is to send her down to the state child center." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. The news wasn't entirely unexpected, but it still hit him hard. He had hoped, somewhere deep down, that a long-lost aunt or uncle might appear and offer Maya a proper home. Now, faced with the reality that there was no one else, he felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. Daniel's phone buzzed on the kitchen table, startling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID and felt a flicker of surprise. It was his old partner, Mike, from the precinct. They hadn't spoken in weeks. "Hey, Mike, what's up?" Daniel answered, trying to keep his tone casual. Mike's voice came through, tight with concern. "Daniel, I've got some news you need to hear. It's about the girl." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He turned away from the window where Maya was still playing, lowering his voice. "What about her?" "CPS received an anonymous tip," Mike said. "Someone reported that you're keeping a child in your home without proper authorization." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He closed his eyes, willing this to be a bad dream. But Mike's voice continued, confirming his worst fears. "They're looking into it, Daniel. It's only a matter of time before they show up at your door." Daniel's mind raced. How had this happened? Who could have tipped them off? He thought they'd been so careful. "Thanks for the heads up, Mike," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, Daniel stood frozen in the kitchen, his world crumbling around him. The laughter from the backyard now seemed distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. He knew the protocol. CPS would come, ask their questions, and then— Daniel couldn't bear to finish the thought. The image of Maya being taken away, confused and scared, tore at his heart. With shaking hands, he dialed Grace's number. She answered on the second ring. "Grace, we've got trouble," he said, explaining the situation in hushed tones. "Oh, Daniel," Grace sighed. "I was afraid something like this might happen. What are you going to do?" Daniel looked out at Maya again, watching as she twirled in the sunlight, carefree and happy. In that moment, he made his decision. "I'm not letting them take her, Grace. I can't. She's been through too much already." "Daniel, be careful," Grace warned. "You could lose everything." As much as Daniel loved Maya, he knew he could not commit a crime, so eventually, he gave in to all the inner resistance and decided to cooperate. He woke up early the next morning. His doorbell rang at 9 a.m. sharp. Daniel's heart sank as he opened the door to find 2 CPS workers standing on his porch. "Officer Brooks?" the woman asked, her voice professional but cold. "I'm Sarah from Child Protective Services. We're here about Maya." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Come in," he managed to say. As they entered the living room, Maya appeared in the hallway, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes widened at the sight of the strangers. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice small and scared. Daniel knelt down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetie. These people just want to talk to us for a bit." The male CPS worker stepped forward. "Maya, we're here to help you. We're going to take you somewhere safe until we can figure out the best place for you to live." Maya's grip on her rabbit tightened. "But I want to stay here with Daniel," she said, her lower lip trembling. Daniel's heart broke. He turned to the social workers, his voice pleading. "Look, I know this isn't by the book, but Maya's doing well here. She's happy. She's going to school. Can't we work something out?" The CPS officer shook her head. "I'm sorry, Officer Brooks, but you have no legal standing here. They told Daniel that somebody had tipped them off saying that Daniel used to beat the child and keep her locked in his house. When Daniel got to know about this, he was completely shocked. Who could say such a thing? Apart from some of his trusted cop buddies and Grace, nobody knew what he was up to." As they talked, Maya clung to Daniel's leg, her small body shaking. Daniel could feel her tears soaking through his pants. "Please," he tried one last time, "just give me a chance to apply for guardianship. I can provide a good home for her." The male worker shook his head. "I'm sorry, but that's not how this works. We need to take Maya now. The only way that you can get legal guardianship was if you had taken a legal route, instead of keeping her locked in your house. You are lucky we aren't arresting you right now." Daniel looked down at Maya, his heart breaking. He knelt down to her level, gently wiping away her tears. "Maya, sweetie, I'm so sorry, but you have to go with these people for now." Maya's face crumpled. "No, Daniel. Please don't let them take me," she cried, throwing her arms around his neck. Daniel hugged her tightly, fighting back his own tears. "I promise I'll do everything I can to bring you back home," he whispered. "Be brave for me, okay?" As the social workers gently pried Maya away, she clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her sobs echoing through the house. Daniel watched helplessly as they led her to their car, feeling as if a piece of his heart was being torn away. Daniel slumped onto his couch, the house feeling emptier than ever before. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the laughter and chatter that had filled these rooms just yesterday. He buried his face in his hands, his mind replaying Maya's tearful goodbye over and over. "What have I done?" he muttered to himself, guilt gnawing at his insides. He'd promised to protect her, to give her a home, and now she was back in the system he'd tried so hard to keep her from. His phone buzzed, startling him from his thoughts. It was Grace. "Daniel? How are you holding up?" Her warm voice came through the speaker. He sighed heavily. "Not great, Grace. I feel like I've failed her." "You haven't failed anyone," Grace said firmly. "You gave that little girl love and stability when she needed it most. Now we just need to fight to bring her home for good." Daniel felt a spark of hope at Grace's words. "You're right," he said, sitting up straighter. "But where do we even start?" "First things first," Grace replied. "We need to find out who made that anonymous tip." It might give us a clue about what we're up against. Daniel nodded, his cop instincts kicking in. Good thinking. I'll start making some calls, see if I can trace it back. As he hung up, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He may have stumbled, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. Maya needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. He glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Sleep seemed impossible. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts. There had to be someone who could help, someone who knew something about the anonymous tip. His finger hovered over Jim's name, his old partner at the precinct. "Come on, Jim, pick up," Daniel muttered as the phone rang. "Hello?" Jim's groggy voice answered. "Jim, it's Daniel. Sorry to call so late, but I need your help." There was a pause. "This about the little girl?" "Yeah," Daniel sighed. "I need to know who made that anonymous tip to CPS. Can you dig around for me?" Jim hesitated. "Daniel, you know I can't just—" "Please, Jim." Daniel's voice cracked. "She's all alone in that shelter. I promised I'd protect her." Another pause. "I'll see what I can do. But Daniel, be careful. You're treading on thin ice here." "Thanks, Jim, I owe you one." As he hung up, Daniel's mind wandered to Maya. Was she scared? Did she think he'd abandoned her? The thought made his stomach churn. Miles away in a stark room filled with bunk beds, Maya huddled under a thin blanket. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly. The unfamiliar sounds of other children crying and whispering filled the air. "I want to go home," she whispered to her rabbit. "I want Daniel." An older girl in the next bed overheard her. "Hey, kid, are you new here?" Maya nodded, sniffling. "It gets easier," the girl said, not unkindly. "Just keep your head down and stay quiet." Maya buried her face in her pillow, longing for the safety of Daniel's house. She didn't understand why she had to leave. Didn't Daniel want her anymore? Back at his house, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and his laptop. He'd been combing through every detail of Maya's case, looking for anything that might help. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he couldn't stop. "There has to be something," he muttered, rubbing his temples. As the night wore on, Daniel's determination only grew stronger. He might have lost this battle, but he wasn't about to lose the war. Somehow, some way, he would bring Maya home. Then, Daniel got a call from Jim. He had been working tirelessly, making calls and pulling strings to uncover the source of the anonymous tip. "Daniel, I've got it!" Grace exclaimed. "It was your neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She saw Maya playing in your yard and gave us the anonymous tip." But the more he thought about it, the more something didn't add up. Why would Mrs. Thompson, a seemingly harmless woman who lived next door, made such a drastic move? There was only one way to find out. He slipped a small portable tape recorder into the inside pocket of his jacket. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation filling him. He knew confronting Mrs. Thompson wouldn't be easy, but it had to be done. Whatever she was hiding, he needed to expose it, not just for his sake, but for Maya's. He had to get her back. Daniel walked to the front door, his hands shaking as he reached for the knob. He wasn't just confronting a neighbor. He was confronting a woman who had tried to remove Maya from his life, a woman who was entangled in the tragic mystery surrounding Maya's parents. Taking a deep breath, he headed out the door and toward Mrs. Thompson's house. When he reached her front porch, Daniel hesitated for a moment, glancing at the neat flower beds and freshly painted shutters. On the surface, Mrs. Thompson's home looked ordinary, peaceful even. But beneath the surface lay secrets that had already caused so much pain. He knocked firmly on the door, waiting for her to answer. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Mrs. Thompson. Her face was a mask of forced politeness, but Daniel could see something flicker in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "Daniel," she said, her voice tight. "What can I do for you? Is everything all right?" Daniel straightened his posture, forcing himself to stay calm. "We need to talk, Mrs. Thompson. It's important." Her expression faltered slightly, but she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Daniel walked into the cozy living room, taking in the perfectly arranged furniture and the soft scent of lavender. Everything looked so normal, yet he knew the truth was far from it. As Mrs. Thompson closed the door behind him, Daniel's hand brushed the tape recorder in his pocket, reassuring himself that it was on and recording. He turned to face her, his voice steady but firm. "Why did you report me to CPS?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I thought it was the right thing to do," she said, her voice strained. "I saw that little girl and I wasn't sure if she was safe. I didn't know what was going on." Daniel narrowed his eyes, not buying her act for a second. "Don't lie to me," he said, his tone growing sharper. "You knew exactly who Maya is. You knew about her parents, didn't you? That's why you kept looking into my window and ran away like a ghost when Maya was about to see you one day. Don't you lie to me." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though the way her eyes flickered, the way her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides, told a different story. "You do know," Daniel pressed, his voice calm but insistent. He wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "You knew about Maya's parents. You knew about the accident." At the mention of the accident, Mrs. Thompson flinched, her eyes widening for a split second before she quickly composed herself. But Daniel saw it. He'd been trained to notice the little things, the tells that people tried to hide. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice so low that Daniel almost didn't catch it. His stomach tightened. He had been right. There was something more, something dark hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent woman. He took a step closer, keeping his voice steady. "What do you mean, Mrs. Thompson? What didn't you mean for it to happen?" Her hands shook as she wrung them together, her gaze now fixed on the floor. "It was an accident," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hit their car. I didn't see them coming." Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had suspected something was off, but this was worse than he had imagined. "You were driving the car that hit Maya's parents?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face ashen. "Yes, it was me. I was coming home late that night. I didn't see the stop sign. By the time I realized, it was too late." The room seemed to spin for a moment as Daniel processed her confession. He had suspected that Mrs. Thompson was hiding something, but this was the reason Maya was alone, the reason her parents were gone. It was Mrs. Thompson who had orphaned the little girl he had grown to love. "And Maya?" Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Did she see you?" Mrs. Thompson nodded again, tears welling in her eyes. "She was in the back seat of their car. She saw everything. When I got out, she was staring at me, just staring. I didn't know what to do. I panicked." Daniel's jaw clenched. "So instead of owning up to what you did, you've been trying to cover it up this whole time? You're the one who tipped CPS to take Maya away from me, aren't you?" Mrs. Thompson's head hung low, and her silence was all the confirmation Daniel needed. "You didn't want Maya to tell anyone what she saw," Daniel continued, the anger rising in his chest. "That's why you've been watching her, following her. You've been trying to keep her quiet." "I didn't know what else to do," Mrs. Thompson cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "If she told anyone, they'd take everything from me. My life would be over. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was an accident." Daniel shook his head, disgusted. "You left a little girl to fend for herself. You tried to take her away from the only person she trusted. That's more than an accident, Mrs. Thompson. That's selfish. That's cruel." Mrs. Thompson sobbed, but Daniel felt no sympathy. He had spent too long protecting Maya, too long trying to give her a sense of stability, only to find out that this woman had been trying to tear that away from her all along. "You need to come forward," Daniel said, his voice hard. "You need to go to the police and tell them what happened. You owe it to Maya." Mrs. Thompson shook her head violently, her sobs turning frantic. No, I can't do that. They'll arrest me. I'll lose everything." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small tape recorder, holding it up for Mrs. Thompson to see. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and firm. "I've been recording our entire conversation. Either you go to the police on your own or I hand this over and they'll come to you. But one way or another, you're going to confess." Mrs. Thompson's face drained of all color as she stared at the tape recorder in Daniel's hand. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For a moment, it looked like she might faint. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go. I'll confess." Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief. It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. Mrs. Thompson was going to take responsibility for what she had done, and Maya would finally have a chance at some form of justice for her parents. "Good," Daniel said, slipping the tape recorder back into his pocket. "You'll come with me to the station now. We'll make sure this is done right." Mrs. Thompson nodded again, her face pale and tear-streaked as she led the way to the door. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Daniel felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, anger, sorrow, all swirling together in a confusing mess. But above all, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for Maya, and though the battle wasn't over yet, he had won this round. As they approached his car, Daniel glanced back at Mrs. Thompson, who looked like a woman headed to her own execution. He didn't pity her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. But more than anything, Daniel thought of Maya, of the little girl who had lost so much, yet still clung to hope. The police station was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that made even the smallest sound seem louder. Mrs. Thompson was scared, and Maya, well, he didn't even know how Maya would react to seeing the woman who had changed her life forever. Inside the interrogation room, Mrs. Thompson sat across from the officers, her hands trembling as she told them everything. Daniel listened from the hallway, feeling a mix of emotions as she spoke. She described how she had been driving too fast that night, how she hadn't seen the stop sign until it was too late. Her voice wavered as she explained the moment of impact, how she had stepped out of her car in shock to see the crumpled wreck of Maya's parents' vehicle. "It was all so fast," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I just didn't see them." The officers listened intently, their expressions serious as they jotted down notes. Daniel could hear everything, but his mind was already racing ahead. He knew that a confession wasn't enough. The law required more. Proof. And that proof, sadly, was Maya herself. Maya was the only witness to the accident, the only one who had seen Mrs. Thompson at the scene that night. Daniel's heart ached at the thought of bringing her here, of asking her to relive that horrible night. But there was no other way. One of the officers, a man named Sergeant Collins, turned to Daniel and gave him a nod. "We're going to need to bring Maya in," he said. "She's the only one who can confirm Mrs. Thompson's story." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll go get her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He then went to the orphanage. Seeing Daniel, Maya came running to him and hugged him tightly. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, completely unaware of what he was about to ask her to do. "Maya," Daniel began softly, sitting beside her, "we need to go to the police station. They're going to ask you some questions." Maya's face scrunched up in confusion. "Questions? About what?" Daniel took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Do you remember that night? The night your parents—" He trailed off, unsure how to continue. "There was a woman there, Maya, the one who hit your parents' car." Maya's expression changed in an instant. Her eyes clouded over with fear, and she hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter to her chest. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's heart broke at the sight of her distress. "I know it's hard, sweetie," he said gently, "but we need your help. The police need to know what happened. They need you to tell them if you recognize the woman." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes and she shook her head. "I don't want to see her," she cried. "I don't want to." Daniel pulled her into a hug, rubbing her back soothingly. "It's okay, Maya. I'll be with you the whole time. You don't have to be scared. Just tell the truth. That's all anyone wants." Maya sniffled, her small body shaking with fear. You'll stay with me?" "I promise," Daniel said firmly. "I won't leave your side." A short while later, Daniel and Maya arrived at the police station. Sergeant Collins met them at the front desk and knelt down to Maya's level, offering her a kind smile. "Hi, Maya. I'm Sergeant Collins. We just need to ask you a couple of questions, okay? Nothing to be scared of." Maya nodded, though her grip on Daniel's hand tightened. Daniel squeezed her hand back, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're doing great, Maya," he whispered. "I'm right here with you." They led her into a small room where Mrs. Thompson sat, looking pale and terrified. Maya froze when she saw her, her eyes going wide with recognition. The sight of the woman brought back memories that Maya had tried so hard to forget. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned to Daniel, her lower lip trembling. "That's her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the lady." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions serious. "Are you sure, Maya?" Sergeant Collins asked gently. "Take your time. We just need to know if you recognize this woman." Maya nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sure. She was there. She hurt my mommy and daddy." Mrs. Thompson let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. The weight of her guilt was clear on her face, and there was no denying it now. Maya's testimony had sealed the case. The officers moved quickly, placing Mrs. Thompson in handcuffs and reading her rights. "You're under arrest for leaving the scene of an accident and for causing the death of Maya's parents," one of the officers said sternly. As they led Mrs. Thompson away, Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The truth was out, and justice would finally be served. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the sadness that lingered in the air. Mrs. Thompson had made a terrible mistake, and now she would have to live with the consequences for the rest of her life. Daniel smiled, though his heart still felt heavy. "She's a special kid," he said quietly. "I just wanted to do right by her." Collins nodded. "Well, you've done more than that. We've been talking, and given everything you've done for Maya, we think you're the best person to take care of her. If you're interested, we'd like to recommend you for custody." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Custody? The word echoed in his mind, filling him with a mix of shock and joy. Was this really happening? After everything they had been through, could he really become Maya's legal guardian? He looked down at Maya, who was still clutching her stuffed rabbit and wiping away the last of her tears. The thought of her going back into the system, of her ending up in another shelter, was unbearable. She had been through so much already. She deserved stability. She deserved a family, and Daniel wanted to be that family for her. "I would love that," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want nothing more than to give her a safe, loving home." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and court hearings. But through it all, Daniel remained focused on one thing: giving Maya the home she deserved. The day the judge finally granted him legal custody of Maya was one of the happiest days of his life. Maya sat beside him in the courtroom, her little hand in his, as the judge read out the decision. Given the circumstances and the extraordinary lengths Officer Brooks has gone to in order to care for Maya, it is the court's decision that full legal custody of Maya Harris be awarded to Daniel Brooks. The words hit Daniel like a wave, filling him with a joy he had never felt before. He looked down at Maya, who was beaming up at him with a wide, toothy smile. "Does that mean I get to stay with you forever?" she asked excitedly. Daniel laughed, his heart overflowing with happiness. "Yes, sweetie, that means we get to stay together forever." Maya threw her arms around Daniel's neck, hugging him tightly. "I love you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice full of pure, innocent joy. "I love you too, Maya," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. From that day forward, Daniel and Maya began their new life together as a family. The days were filled with laughter, warmth, and love. Daniel helped Maya with her homework, took her to the park, and read her bedtime stories every night. And Maya, in turn, brought light and joy into Daniel's life in a way he never thought possible. Time flew by quickly after that fateful day at the courthouse. Years passed, and Maya began to grow into a confident, bright young girl. The once timid and fragile child who had curled up on a park bench with nothing but a stuffed rabbit had blossomed into a happy, thriving girl. Daniel watched with pride as she excelled in school, made friends, and became the light of his life. Their little house had changed over the years, too. What had once been a quiet and almost empty place now had vibrant colors, a messy kitchen table covered with homework and crayons, and walls adorned with Maya's art. It had become a home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. From that moment on, Daniel and Maya lived their lives with a bond that no one could break. The pain and loss they had both experienced in the past were no longer the defining parts of their story. They had found each other, and that was all that mattered. And so, the once homeless girl who had slept on a park bench every night found her forever home with the man who took her in, not just as an officer trying to help, but as a father who loved her more than words could ever express. Daniel thanked his lucky stars that he had found Maya that night in the park, that he had taken a chance, broken the rules, and followed his heart. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I handpicked this next story that's even more twisted. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.